Hello and good afternoon. My name is Dan Hayden. Thank you for joining us today for what's expected to be a really interesting conversation about cyber liability, the risks that are facing businesses, and the risks that businesses may not be aware that they're actually exposed to. So, just for the benefit of the group here, we're going to begin here shortly. I just want to give a couple of seconds for some additional people to join. I know we have quite the attendance today. Very topical piece of conversation in recent media, recent court decisions. So, we're expecting a lot of interest here, and we certainly garnered that. So, just a couple of brief seconds here, and then we'll begin. Well, in the interest of time, we'll be conscientious of everyone's schedule. It's just after 2 o'clock here, Eastern Standard Time. I know we have some guests there on the opposite side of the country right now, so welcome. Again, my name is Dan Hayden. I'm the Director of Risk Services for the Seltzer Group. We're a large independent agency here in central Pennsylvania. Before we begin our presentation, I just wanted to go over some quick housekeeping items. So first off, all of the attendees are going to be on mute. That's just from an efficiency standpoint. The panelists that are visible here on your screen will be unmuted. We also ask that during the presentation, if you have any questions, which I would imagine that you will, certainly feel free to exercise the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. For those of you that are familiar with Zoom, and for the most part, if you're like me, you've become an expert in Zoom over the past 3 months. So we're going to ask you to use the Q&A feature as opposed to the chat feature, and then we're going to devote some time at the end of our presentation just to respond to those questions. So, well, on behalf of the panelists here that are joined with me and the Seltzer Group, first would like to extend our deepest sympathies and condolences to any of those that have family members or friends that have been affected by the pandemic that's been decimating our country for the past 3 months. We certainly empathize with the situations that everyone's found themselves in, and we sincerely hope that you and your families are remaining healthy and safe. And we look forward to seeing you in person hopefully soon. So without further ado, let's proceed here with some objectives for today's discussion. So essentially, why are we here? Why did we ask you to join? What inspired you or motivated you? We were trying to at least predict what would be some motivations for people that want to learn more about cyber liability. We feel it's our duty as insurance professionals, legal professionals, cyber professionals to educate the masses. So we're here to instill some wisdom. First off, we're going to attempt to develop a better understanding of cyber risk, especially in today's climate. We're going to identify the various sources of cyber exposure that's facing your business. We're going to attempt today to educate participants on some specific case law, and specifically in Pennsylvania and in other states that can affect your duties and responsibilities as business owners and employers. We're going to demystify some uncertainties surrounding the insurance coverage. Often, the insurance world is shrouded in mystery. Today, we're going to have some good conversation about what specifically goes into a cyber liability coverage form and how they can differ. And then finally, we're going to provide some practical strategies to prevent and mitigate your exposure to cyber risk. So a quick agenda, just some brief introductions for our panelists here. We're pleased and honored to be joined this afternoon by first Dave Brennan from Brennan Associates PC. Dave serves as the managing shareholder, and he's here to offer his legal perspective. We're also pleased and honored to be joined by Joe Pochron, who's the Senior Manager of Forensic Integrity Services at Ernst & Young. Joe is based out here in San Francisco, so you can see his beautiful backdrop that's making everyone jealous, for those of us in central Pennsylvania. And then finally, we're joined by one of my esteemed colleagues from the Seltzer Group, Randy Grabiak, who serves as an account executive and subject matter expert on cyber liability exposures in the insurance world. So we're going to begin our conversation today about the scope of exposure. So essentially, we're going to define some terms for you, giving you some context about what's occurring presently in our climate. We're going to move on to a threat landscape, which essentially is going to give you some ideas about what type of nefarious actors are out there? Who are you exposed to? What's your risk? We're going to then transition to the intersection of the cyber liability world and the insurance program. So how does your insurance program respond to that, if at all? And then we're going to move on to some actual claim scenarios that occurred right here in our backyard in Pennsylvania. Then we're going to provide some guidance on managing your cyber risks, both from an operational standpoint, through some technical standpoints. So that's certainly going to be an interest for those attending the webinar this afternoon. And then finally, we're going to end on just some service offerings from us. What's our value proposition? How could we assist you in your organization? And then, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to leave some time for Q&A. So please feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and kindly avoid using the chat box. So our first section, scope of exposure. So for some context here, what is a cyber attack? We hear that word thrown around a lot. There's often misnomers that are attached to that. So to define a cyber attack for the purpose of our conversation today, a cyber attack is an attempt to disable computers, to steal data, or to use a breached computer system to launch additional attacks. Now, there are various types of cyber attacks that you're exposed to, and we're certainly going to go into those in further detail later on. But just know that it's not just one source. Who is at risk for this type of exposure? So cyber exposures and threats have become a common occurrence for all businesses, all shapes and sizes. Joe, would you agree with that as a technical expert in this field?
Yeah, thanks, Dan, and thanks to the Seltzer Group for the invite to speak on this. To answer your question, I mean, who is at risk? 100%. You saw a shift in terms of cyber attacks several years ago, where, you know, I think initially there was certainly there was an interest in kind of causing mayhem, causing business disruption. And what you're seeing now is a much more precise approach to attack businesses, both large and small, because at the end of the day, what they've realized is that the underlying data is really more valuable than causing business disruption. So what you're seeing is bad actors, you know, take advantage of that opportunity to take data, which is realistically often, you know, personally identifiable information, and that's just as valuable from a small business, you know, or a large business, which is why I think you're certainly seeing what has happened, you know, just across the nation over the last year, where you see school districts, municipalities being targeted, small businesses being targeted. Lately, it's been the healthcare industry and hospitals. So yes, 100% agree with that point.
Thanks, Joe. And yeah, and that's really the you know, the shame of all this is that, you know, these bad actors, they don't discriminate, and, you know, often, you know, the victims of these crimes are going to be the most benevolent organizations that we have out there. You know, nonprofits, education centers, hospitals. So that, and the assumption, you know, for, you know, these criminals is that, you know, these organizations, these institutions have less sophisticated defense mechanisms, so they become a greater target. So for these criminals, they don't discriminate. Data is data, and regardless of where they get it from. Also, what we've seen, you know, across the national news is that, you know, these large outfits that get breached, you know, whether it's Target or Home Depot or Walmart, often the source of that breach is coming from subcontractors. Maybe it's your HVAC contractor, as it was in the case with Target. So certainly, you know, you hear about these large breaches, but the most common, you know, we're seeing it amongst small to mid-sized businesses. Some interesting statistics that I came across that I just wanted to share with the group is from the 2018 Travelers Risk Index study. And in that study, it was determined that 1 in 5 businesses have suffered a data breach or cyber attack, and that number has doubled since 2015. So certainly a expanding exposure for businesses, and 52% of those businesses consider it inevitable that they will become a cyber victim. Now, Joe, I know that the old adage in the cyber world is that there's typically 2 types of businesses, right? And what are those, Joe, in your experience?
Yeah, it's you know, kind of very famously quoted. It's those that have been hacked and those who don't know that they've been hacked yet.
Absolutely, and that's exactly what we see from our standpoint as well. What was interesting for me to find as well is that 95% of businesses rely on their computer systems to function properly. Of course, nowadays, who doesn't? So unless you're chiseling things on, stone, chances are, then you're going to be exposed to cyber. So that includes, accepting credit cards or digital payments. Any business that does that, and of course, that's very commonplace these days. Any business that keeps any medical or financial data in their systems, any business that stores any confidential customer employee data, all of those businesses alike are going to be at risk. What was interesting for me to find out too is the false perception that we see. And Randy, we're going to get into this a little bit later on about some misconceptions from an insurance standpoint. But what was interesting to me was the statistic that 91% of businesses surveyed in this Traveler Risk Index said that they're confident that their company has implemented best practices to avoid and mitigate cyber attacks. So that's a great number. Very confident that they're going to be okay. However, 55% of that have not completed a cyber risk assessment, and 62% have not developed a written business continuity plan. And furthermore, 63% of those have not assessed the cybersecurity vendors that have access to their data. So this creates this false assumption that everything is going well. And we're going to get into this a little bit later on about how that confirmation bias can be extremely detrimental to your business, because you might assume everything is going well because you may not necessarily have had a breach that you're aware of. And this creates this false sense of security that unfortunately can overwhelmingly be significant to your business operation. So moving forward here, the COVID-19 pandemic has obviously impacted many segments of the business world. And Joe, from your perspective, how has COVID-19 escalated the already emerging threat of cyber liability?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's stating the obvious, but we have a workforce and really a global workforce that is work from home. That is decentralized. They're on home networks. They're not within the corporate enterprise or infrastructure. So that's certainly one. You have employees that are accessing corporate environments with personal devices, that are outside the purview of IT, or maybe some of those security protocols. So that's certainly really the biggest issue is our threat landscape has expanded greatly, and we only need to go to the news last evening to actually could confirm this. Is the federal government put out a notice that there's a Russian group called Evil Corp that is taking advantage of our work from home at the moment in the U.S. and has kind of put on the full court press in terms of really trying to leverage the soft security in this current environment. So that's really the biggest issue at the moment.
It's very interesting, and we can't reiterate that enough. That with the changing of business models and the adaptation of people working from home, and the likelihood that will continue in the future, I think businesses, especially even our own, have demonstrated resiliency and a dynamic nature to be able to work from home and to still do that efficiently. And I think that has been sort of the trend in recent years as well, to sort of decentralize your workforce. And I can imagine that that's certainly something that's going to continue. So very interesting, and it's something where COVID-19 obviously has broad outreach, and this is just another segment of the business world that's being affected, fortunately. So you mentioned threat landscape, which I think is an elegant way of describing what businesses and business leaders are facing out there. And from our perspective, there's really two sources of threats. There's internal threats, and then there are external threats. Joe, can you differentiate for us, and based on your experience, the internal and external cyber threats that are facing businesses?
Certainly. I'll start with the external because I think that's what we commonly think of. Certainly external, those are state-sponsored, sophisticated hacking groups that are coming up with some very complex strains of ransomware or malware that's being distributed. I mean, we certainly see that coming from other countries. In addition to that, though, and I think this is important, is while we may have nation states that are creating these complex strains of malware, quite honestly, they're for sale on the dark web. Anybody here could, if you look hard enough, you could go out to the dark web, you could purchase, a ransomware kit, and you could deploy an operation if you want to. So from a bad actor standpoint, I mean, it really does run the gamut of sophisticated operations from countries from outside the U.S. To individuals that are motivated that are purchasing them and leveraging them for their own benefit. From an internal standpoint, and we often refer to this as insider threats. And it really falls into two buckets. One is those are clearly individuals, that are working within the business, have access to sensitive records. Where we see it often is we see data that leaves the business that is highly sensitive. They go to work for like another a competitor. So that's certainly one. But the one we don't often talk about, which I think is important for here as it talks to cyber risk, is insider threats also include employees that aren't trained on cyber awareness, that their actions within your business as an employee, if they're not trained, they're a risk to the business. So, ensuring you have policies, procedures, and really training in place, really reduces that insider threat risk.
Thanks, Joe. That's very insightful, and obviously, for a business owner, I'd be terrified that not only are my threats coming from external forces, which I think I can maybe wrap my head around, but I'm also going to be facing inside threats as well. And I think just getting back on the external threat for a second, I think historically we viewed external threats as like the lone wolf hacker type persona. But what you're saying is that in recent years that's transitioned to actual organized crime elements or state-sponsored terror. And what countries are really attacking us? You mentioned Russia earlier, but are there any other countries out there that are prone to attacking us?
It's what you see in the news. It's no surprise. I mean, you certainly see Iran stepping up their operations, North Korea, China, Russia. You're seeing a lot of activity out of there. But really, what I would focus on as well is the sophistication has changed. And I think the one thing that I think just in general the cybersecurity community is maybe the word is impressed with is they will sit in an environment. This isn't a quick kind of we want to deploy ransomware and just kind of disrupt the business. They'll sit in an environment. They'll wait till they see what they want to. It's just a much more precise attack at this point to monitor activity, monitor email, and then they'll really kind of step it up when they see the right opportunity. So I would just say the sophistication of the campaigns has grown exponentially, and it moves very quick. In a matter of seconds, you're going to have encrypted data. They'll already have likely overwritten backups. So you really need to prepare for this because it's definitely too late if it's already occurred and you haven't thought about this.
Absolutely. Very, very distressing, to say the least. I wanted to play a quick video here that we have underlined. This is produced by Travelers Insurance, who's a partner agency of ours, that illustrates the different types of cyber criminals that are out there. And I thought it was a good way of just visualizing this for our audience. So I'm going to get out here to site and let's make sure that this works.
Hey, Dan, I don't know if anyone can see the video.
So if can anyone view that? First of all, Randy, you said that you don't think that that's possible, and I apologize if those joining us weren't able to view that. We'll send that out as a link as some homework. But essentially, what that video was illustrating was that there are basically five main types of cyber criminals that are out there, and you'll be able to view that after following our presentation today. But it just gives you an overview of the types of cyber crimes that the people are facing. So again, I apologize. And how ironic that I'm having cyber issues during a cyber liability.
They got the YouTube. They can even get the YouTube.
They can, absolutely. So, so let's move forward here in the presentation. So let's see. Okay. So moving forward, I want to transition to the insurance program as a whole and the intersection of cyber liability and insurance itself. So Randy, can you just provide us with some historical perspective as to how the insurance product has evolved over the years?
Yeah, it's hard to wrap our heads around the fact that internet really isn't that old. I mean, a lot of us can't imagine not having it. Can't imagine not being able to look at our phone or look something up when we walk down the street. But it really wasn't that long ago that internet first came about. And how this affects the insurance standpoint is things like property coverage, general liability coverage. These things have been around for a very long time comparatively to cyber coverage. We have a lot more case law for those things. There's a lot more claims that have arisen. Risks are fairly known for those items. When you compare that to cyber liability, we don't know all the risks for cyber liability yet. We're still learning. Carriers are still learning what kind of packages they need to put together. So because of that, each policy is going to be a little bit different carrier to carrier. You know, if you look at a general liability form or a property form across all the different carriers that are out there, there's going to be some uniformity to those. It's pretty standardized. That's not the case with cyber liability policies. Each carrier is going to have something maybe completely different from their counterpart. So some of the things that you want to look for when looking at a cyber liability policy, and these are going to sound like some buzzwords, but some things you want to make sure that you're looking at when looking at a good policy is stuff like information security and privacy liability, privacy breach response services, website media content liability. You want to make sure that the stuff that is being broadcast from your website is covered. Regulatory defense and penalties, PCI fines, expenses, and costs, and those are things that, you know, if you do get penalized for the material that's being broadcast, you have coverage for that. Cyber extortion is an interesting one. Dan, you had mentioned the statistic 95% of businesses do rely on computers. Well, can you imagine a situation where you come into work that day and you don't have access to anything on your system? Your computer it isn't working because someone launched a cyber attack. They jammed up your network and said, give us X amount of dollars and we'll release your network to you. Just imagine that scenario. So you want coverage for that. First-party data protection. Fraudulent instruction is another interesting one that we've seen too that pops up. So those are just some examples of some things that you commonly want to see on a policy. And then as far as some of the misconceptions that we see when it comes to insurance, a lot of the times you'll see on maybe a general liability policy or a property policy, you'll see some sort of enhancement package, maybe known as like a value pack or something like that. And essentially what that is, carriers like to give some add-ons and they like to give some extra coverage for a lot of things you don't think about. These typically include coverage limits that are on the smaller side, and they're just supposed to be enhancements to their product to kind of separate that. Now, one thing that can be harmful in those situations when it comes to cyber coverage is a lot of the times there will be a small cyber enhancement or cyber coverage is thrown into those situations. So what people do is they look at their policy, their GL or their property policy, and they see, oh, I have cyber coverage, I'm covered. Well, essentially all that is that's going to be just a very small policy that's a part of those add-ons. It's going to be extremely limited. There's going to be a lot of exclusions. In our opinion, that's not going to be what you need. You're going to need a standalone policy. That's what we recommend. And essentially what your best bet's to go to your agent, come to me, come to Dan, and we'll walk you through what you need. We'll assess your business and make sure that you have the coverage that you need. So with that all being said, there's also a lot of regulation and there's a lot of laws that have to do with a lot of this stuff. So I think, Dave, you could probably shed some more light on those items for us.
Yeah, if you are a business owner, rest assured there's a regulation that will apply to you, and there's going to be more as we progress through the world of cyber liability, and as this issue becomes more pronounced. I had a slide that will pop up. There it is. With just some sample regulations that apply to these kinds of issues. Some of these have been around for a while. Some of them are more well-known than others. But just a sample. HIPAA, everyone knows HIPAA. It's designed to protect employee health information. When it was originally enacted, the idea was to protect documentary evidence, but more and more hospitals, doctors' offices, employers are collecting health-related information electronically. So that needs to be protected. The Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act deals with disclosure of educational records. Again, things that were traditionally documentary but are now collected electronically. Health Information Technology for Economic and Clinical Health Act, it's a big one. That is dealing with a business that has doctor's offices, essentially, when you're transitioning from the old paper files to electronic health records. Graham-Leach-Bliley Act relates to products offered by and information gathered by financial institutions. The Fair Credit Reporting Act has been around for a very long time, and that deals with any information that a consumer reporting agency would collect. Again, many of these things were done traditionally with pen and paper and was not an issue, but now that it's collected and the data is collected electronically, it is an issue. Each state has their own set of privacy laws. The one that was recently enacted, and Joe probably knows more about this than I do, but I thought as a sample, the California Consumer Privacy Act is a state law that grants privacy rights to electronic data. The Personal Information Protection Electronic Documents Act, again, that is a law that helps with respect to how businesses collect, store, and disclose personal information. And here in Pennsylvania, we have the Breach of Personal Information Act, which basically is a law that mandates protecting data that's collected. And if there is a breach, a hack, sorry, my screen went blank there. There is a mechanism and a rule there that provides that you have a duty to notify all members that may have been affected by that hack. And again, there's going to be regulations, whatever state you do business in. One of the things to be aware of is not just within the state that you are incorporated, but as I said, the state you do business in. So there's going to be, if you do business in New Jersey, you have to be aware of that there's going to be New Jersey related regulations. If you do business overseas in the EU, there's going to be European Union regulations to deal with. Up in Canada, there'll be Canadian regulations. The one law that I had referenced there, the Personal Information Protection Electronic Documents Act, is a Canadian law. But you would be subject to that if, for some reason, you're doing business up there and someone hacks your system and gets your information. A more practical application and a more, what I'll say, alarming thing that most business owners need to be aware of isn't from regulation, but from case law, particularly in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania's Supreme Court decided an issue in 2018, a case of Dittman versus UPMC. This case arose out of a UPMC's information system being hacked, with employee personal and financial information being stolen, for lack of a better word. Some of this information was used to file fraudulent tax returns, among other things. And when this class action was brought, it was brought as a class action on behalf of over 62,000 members. Okay. One of the counts in the case was for negligence. Now, that has not been recognized by the courts prior to this decision. Now, this case started back in, I believe, 2014, and then ultimately ended up in the Supreme Court, primarily based on this one count of negligence. Supreme Court ruled a couple of things. One, moving forward, employers have a duty to exercise reasonable care to safeguard their employees' sensitive personal information stored on internet accessible computer systems, and that UPMC owed this duty to exercise reasonable care in collecting and storing this information. Now, it uses the word in their holding employers. Okay, and Dan, if you can switch to the next slide there. It uses the word employers, but I have no doubt that that's going to be expanded to include anybody who has access to and stores personal information. If you know, and that's all encompassing, and it can really increase your exposure. Perhaps the biggest part of that ruling in that case, though, deals with what's referred to as the economic loss doctrine. And so going back to the count of negligence, in a negligence action, economic damages, I apologize, without any physical injury or property damage are typically barred in a negligence action. So if you think about a data breach, nobody gets hurt, nobody's property is damaged. Why would you be able to allege negligence? Well, until Dittman, you couldn't allege negligence. Why is negligence in a lawsuit dangerous? Well, negligence is a tort. Tort has damages that are not very well defined, okay? It's not defined statutorily. It is a common law concept. For example, in a personal injury case, a negligence action allows a jury to award pain and suffering. Well, there's no statute, there's no book that identifies how much pain and suffering is worth. So the economic loss doctrine being knocked out of this case and being inapplicable, and the ability for an attorney to allege negligence opens up a Pandora's box, and the threat and the exposure can be huge. Not just for a lawsuit, but let's think about something that Joe had mentioned, something that Randy had mentioned. Let's think about ransomware. If these bad actors now know that you have a threat to defend yourself against a lawsuit, and you are open to a negligence claim, an open-ended damages claim, their ransom that they're going to demand in order to release whatever chokehold they have on your data is only going to increase. So it's something to be very, very aware of moving forward, not necessarily the regulations that are guiding you in your business, but the damages that are now available to or that you are exposed to as a result. So some practical guidelines, and there are a lot of things that you can do to prevent cyber attacks from a legal perspective. The number one way, which is not on here, is to completely eliminate any computer systems you have in your business. I'm saying that tongue in cheek. Obviously, that's impossible. The world is such a place right now that we need computers, we need access to electronic data. Many places don't even accept anything other than electronic data. So given that this type of equipment and technology is required, you are going to be exposed. It doesn't matter. In fact, when we were coming up with the title to this webinar, the evolving threat to business, it seemed that's exactly what it is. And COVID-19 makes it even more exposure with given that people are allowed to work from home, etc. So a couple of things that I wanted to point out. There's an industry data security standard, PCI DSS. If you want to look that up, or if you want to contact me, I can give you some information. I'll give some good information if you are a business owner, and I'm a law firm. We accept credit cards, okay? Most businesses do. It gives some really good criteria to avoid data breaches. It's not a law, it's not a regulation, but it gives a good laundry list of standards that can be followed, such as, and these sound simple, but they're not always implemented. You need to be able to protect stored cardholder data, have a great firewall configuration, use and update your antivirus software, develop and maintain security systems, restrict access, assign unique ID numbers, etc. So if you want to look that up, that will give you they have a checklist of about 12 or 13 things. Those are the things that can help avoid a hack, if you will. Now, when it comes to the law and the liability, the more things that you do to prevent a data breach will help. So in other words, if we go back to the Dittman case where it said employers now have a duty to exercise reasonable care. Well, okay, what is reasonable? The more you do to prevent a data breach, the more reasonable you will appear. Okay, so if you don't think that having a firewall is important, if you don't think that assigning a unique ID to people to get into your system is important, if you don't regularly test your security on your system is important, you are going to appear to be unreasonable. So the more you do to prevent any kind of exposure or a data breach like that, the more you can limit your exposure. And the damages that you could be facing, you could have individual lawsuits, you could have a class action lawsuit. Class actions don't have to be 62,000 members. Class actions can be 10 people. A lot of people don't know that. A class action doesn't need to be a huge number of people. You don't want the government coming in and investigating something that may have happened on your system, whether that's a criminal investigation or some other investigation related to the accidental disclosure of personal financial data. You could be subject to an audit. Maybe something that if you have cyber insurance and you have cyber coverage, there might be something in your policy that requires you to do certain things, and if you didn't do it, that may be a reason to disclaim coverage. Your insurance could absolutely go through the roof in terms of premiums, and I unfortunately think that may happen moving forward, at least in Pennsylvania, and I think it's going to happen nationwide with this Dittman decision, because your exposure now is increased as a result of the damages that could be imposed. If you are in a field that involves malpractice insurance, E&O coverage, that could expose you to some kind of malpractice case, and that could go across the board. I recently, because there's nothing else to do during a pandemic, I decided to open my own title insurance business. This is one of those do as I say, not as I do things. I ended up getting cyber insurance for that and my law firm. And, it's something that I'm hoping I will never have to tap into. And Dan switched slides. That means it's time for me to shut up. When you give an attorney an open mic for a couple minutes, you're in trouble. Thanks, everybody.
I was going to cue the award music, but no, you were raising some very interesting points. And, I, for one, am certainly terrified of what's out there. And hearing it from your legal perspective just makes me even more scared. Just to kind of recap that, there's a lot of things that are facing businesses, especially in Pennsylvania. Joe, I know you being based in California, I know you have some Consumer Privacy Act laws that have been recently enacted as a result of some unfavorable case law. How are you seeing this from a perspective of, like, looking ahead? If you have to give, kind of prediction, if you have your crystal ball, what are we looking at in terms of, are these obligations going to extend to other states? In your day-to-day life, do you see these issues arise, not just in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, I mean, all the time. So in terms of my crystal ball, if we're going to see similar privacy laws or acts enacted in other states. I mean, we're already seeing it. There's several in motion. And I think Dave hit the nail on the head. I mean, the word and really as it relates to CCPA, like where I'm sitting, and it's the timing on this is a bit fortuitous. That CCPA went into action on January 1st, 2020, but it actually isn't enforceable until July 1st, which is right upon us. So we're about to see what's going to happen with that. But the key language in there, there's a lot. It's a pretty complex act. But for us, as it relates to security, is they're going to be looking if businesses have reasonable security, and Dave hit on a bunch of those reasonable security measures, but even some other things that we still don't see, like some very simple things like multi-factor authentication. Do folks have multi-factor authentication? A lot of these bad actors, once they're in the system, what they're doing is they're launching basically activity or actions to harvest credentials. They're trying to get usernames and passwords. Multi-factor authentication is going to help to limit some of that lateral movement, if you will. So in terms of the actions, though, I mean, I think the key word and the key takeaway from this is you're going to have to look, do you have reasonable security in place? Because at least in my interaction as well with insurers that are dealing in cyber insurance, they're looking at the same thing. They want to see, what is your threat landscape? Do you also have reasonable security? It's not just from a regulatory standpoint. I talk to insurers that are looking at the exact same things.
Absolutely, Joe. And Dave, from an insurance perspective, do you think that simply purchasing cyber liability coverage, is that enough for me to demonstrate that I'm reasonable, or are there other factors that go into that?
No, it's a start. It's a start.
Okay.
So it's not just the insurance, it's the hardware, it's the software, it's the whole package. And I think if you can, and I don't think it would be difficult to develop a little bit of a plan. So you should, if you're going to be reasonable about this, you don't only get a cyber insurance or a cyber addendum to your GL policy. You get a separate standalone policy. Now for years I resisted that. And I finally, this is, like I said, I was saying, do as I say, not as I do.
Right.
But I finally got on board. I got a standalone policy primarily because of the business that I started. But make sure, and I think this is critical, that you have a really good IT support, whether it's within your organization or outside your organization. An IT company that can provide really good support, really good protection, both on-site and off-site. I think the more you have there, the more reasonable it can be. It can be costly. It doesn't need to be, but I think, again, from a reasonableness standpoint, you need to be able to show a court and your peers, this was what we did under the circumstances. We think this was reasonable.
Great. Thank you, David. That's exactly, really what I was getting at was that, the limit's enough, even if you just get the bare bones minimum limits, that may not meet the definition of reasonable, and it could be interpreted against your favor. So I wanted to share with the audience here, because I wanted to bring this back down to how this affects us individually. And sometimes these issues are difficult to conceptualize because it's all in theory, or you see it on the news and you hear about these large companies that are getting breached, and you think to yourself, well, that makes sense. They're definitely going to be the targets. But as we learned earlier, that often, and unfortunately, it's the most benevolent organizations amongst us, our nonprofit, our schools, our hospitals, but even our small businesses, mid-sized businesses that are being targeted because, as mentioned earlier, data is data, and these nefarious actors don't care where they get it from. So just some examples of some claims that we've seen recently in our area. I'll give you 4 different examples, and I just wanted to note that of these 4 different claim scenarios, each of these businesses that were targeted all felt that they were comfortable ahead of time, that they had a sophisticated defense mechanism in place. They had hardware that was going to be able to be a deterrent for any kind of like system penetration. But still, these actors, and as Joe mentioned, these guys are becoming even more and more sophisticated as the minute goes by. They were still able to infiltrate and cause damage. So the first example, unfortunately, came from a school district in central Pennsylvania, relatively on the small scale in terms of severity of the claim, but just an example of the types of of crimes that are being perpetrated against them. They unfortunately were the victims of some fraudulent instruction where a nefarious actor gained access to their system, and they sent an email to the HR manager with some fraudulent instruction about direct deposit. So they portrayed themselves to be an employee of the district, and they were so sophisticated, came right down to just a simple character, and the email address was incorrect. They masked themselves in that manner, and they ultimately had instruction sent to the HR manager to change the account information on the employees, the actual employees' deposit information, and a total of $3,500 was transferred to an account, and that account was unable to be traced. And Joe, I'm sure you'll agree that these actors, it's that the web of the chances of law enforcement being able to identify them or prosecute them is very rare, and that's my understanding, right?
Yeah, I mean, and what you just described is one of the most common attacks. I mean, we certainly see ransomware campaigns, but what you see is really that's typically like a business email compromise where they're lying in wait. They wait to see like a wire transfer or some sort of monetary transfer that's about to take place. They step in really as the man in the middle, and then they divert that or send false wire transfer information. And then realistically, what you end up seeing is it goes to a bank, and then it gets diverted somewhere internationally. And as we're all aware, at that point it becomes far more complicated. We don't have a international police force to investigate that. It requires a lot of agencies, and time is of the essence, and usually that's not on the side of those scenarios.
Absolutely. And in that particular case, the school district did have coverage, fortunately. So all they were out was just a meager deductible. But fortunately, they had the foresight to purchase the policy. Otherwise, that's not a significant sum of money, but certainly for a school district, every dollar counts. So the next example is exactly what you were referring to, Joe. A larger masonry contractor in the Philadelphia area, they were the victim of fund transfer fraud, where a nefarious actor gained access to their system and duplicated invoices that were legitimate from another supplier, and that this particular company had paid on multiple occasions, that they were a well-known supplier. So they generated these fictitious invoices that were almost exact to what they had previously received, and the business manager for the contractor was unaware, was accustomed to paying this particular supplier, and ultimately paid $75,000 in fraudulent services to this unknown actor. And unfortunately, in that situation, we did not have coverage for that. The business owner did not believe that was a viable threat, and it wasn't something that he wanted to devote resources to. So unfortunately, there was no coverage in that situation. Another, I would say, a more emerging threat that we see, and this is kind of like the flavor of the week for these nefarious actors, is ransomware attacks. There was in the media here in Lancaster County, a recycling company that fell victim to a ransomware attack where these criminals gained access to the system and basically demanded $100,000 to release their network back to this recycling company, or else they were going to completely destroy all the records. Fortunately, in that situation, the recycling company did purchase coverage in advance, and they did have enough limit to cover that, and the insurance carrier was able to pay that. So certainly a fortunate situation. Very happy that they were able to heed our warnings in advance and certainly purchase that coverage for themselves. And finally, on the larger scale of things, just in central Pennsylvania, there was a medical group that fell victim to a phishing email, and this is something that I'll get back to what Joe you said earlier about. Sometimes it's not the business owners that are going to fall victim to this. It might be an entry-level associate or an account manager level, a customer service rep. That in this particular case, what happened was they clicked on a link that was in a phishing email, and that ultimately allowed these actors to gain access to hundreds of patient records, which required this medical group to hire a computer forensic investigator. They had to hire a PR firm because their reputation was harmed. They were subject to some regulatory fines and penalties, and the total cost of that claim is about $600,000. So, and again, these aren't these large mega data breaches that Joe, Ernst & Young might see on a daily basis. This is what's happening here in our backyard. Joe, any other insight to, are those any other types of I know we missed the video earlier, and I apologize again, but are there any other types of cyber criminals out there Are there other cyber criminal schemes that you're seeing other than the ones that we just highlighted?
Well, I mean, I think the sky's the limit in terms of being creative of how you're going to attack. I mean, I can't think of any off the top of my head. I think you hit the nail on the head. The one thing I will say that came up, it's also applicable to the Seltzer Group, is we've had ransomware campaigns where we have this cyber insurance policy sitting on the same network that got breached. The bad actors open it, view it, and then they place the ransom at that threshold. So, so think about that even while you're actually storing it. But no, I mean, I think you described it. I think you described it perfectly. I mean, that's where you're at. We can certainly talk about some of the real measures you can actually implement and take to mitigate that. The one thing I'd say with that is there's a lot of different cyber scenarios and cyber incidents we're talking about. There's no foolproof plan. If you take the approach that realistically you can get breached. What you want to do is certainly mitigate your risk at that point. Protect the crown jewels, and have a game plan for standing the infrastructure back up. But there's no foolproof plan, no matter how large or small the business is. As you just mentioned, if you have vendors or you have a supply chain that accesses your information, insider threats, outside threats, there's a lot of variables at play. So it's just about mitigating that risk and then having a game plan and preparing to stand the infrastructure back up.
Absolutely. We totally agree. And I think the key point there is that there is no foolproof plan, but what can businesses do to maybe help themselves out? How can we mitigate that? On the screen here, there's some options here about cyber hygiene. What are some operational things that businesses can do, like I said, to mitigate their exposure?
Sure. I mean, so I think there's a couple of things. And I think, one, when's the last time, and these are questions to ask yourself and your business, when's the last time you went through a security assessment? When's the last time you went through a tabletop exercise which is basically emulating one of these incidents, because when these things occur, it brings in a lot of different stakeholders, and do you have an incident response plan even in place? Because realistically, when this happens, it's not just your IT. It's going to be IT. It's going to be legal, both depending if you have in-house counsel or you have outside counsel. It's going to be somebody to clean up the data breach. There's a lot of things. You may have a breach notification depending on what was taken. So there's a lot of things to think about. You may need to notify law enforcement. So there's a lot to think about in these scenarios. So I would say from that standpoint is certainly running through a security assessment. Really taking a look at your infrastructure. Knowing where your data is, knowing where your critical data, your crown jewels are. Putting in the appropriate safeguards at that point, and then putting in an incident response plan.
Absolutely, thank you. And we'll just add that the third tier of that would be, from our perspective, an effective risk transfer program. Absolutely. So we can't say that enough, obviously. So an insurance program in place, and not only just an insurance program, but the right insurance program, is going to be essential and critical to safeguarding your business. So in a nutshell, gentlemen, here, how can we help the audience members here today, and how can we help business owners in Pennsylvania? What can we do? What's our value proposition for them? Dave, I'll start with you. From a legal standpoint, what's something? How do you interact with the insurance world, or how do you interact with the cybersecurity world?
So what I would say from a legal perspective is getting back to what we talked about previously about being reasonable. And I think as this threat evolves and the exposure increases, the team that I talked about is imperative. If someone were to come to me and ask for my advice on, how can I avoid this, I would tell them, as I said before, get a good quality outside IT person, or if you can afford it, if it's on your, get one internally. Then I would. Going back to what Joe said about having a security assessment done, I know when we got our policy, part of that policy was a security assessment. You think everything's great, they can come in, they can look at what you have in place in terms of firewalls and the multi-layer authentication, and give you recommendations for that. If you are the unfortunate victim of a breach, you can come to us and we can assist you with respect to kind of minimizing the damage, if you will. Because once a breach occurs, there's a lot that has to be done in terms of notifying people and getting people on board about, hey, this has happened. Where do we go from here? What happens? Where are we exposed in terms of what do we have to do to notify people? Not just customers, but potential vendors, et cetera, et cetera.
Great points, David. Thank you. Absolutely. And I'll just say from it's obvious from the information we presented today, and I'm sure we can all discuss this for weeks at a time, that this is complicated stuff. And as a business owner, your forte is going to be your business. This is what we do in our daily lives. So whether it's Joe from a cybersecurity perspective, or Randy and myself from an insurance standpoint, or Dave from a legal standpoint. So you don't have to be an expert in this. Come to us for these questions. Certainly contact Randy and I if you are interested in learning more about how you can protect your business. We do have a few minutes left here, and I just wanted to open up for some Q&A. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and then pull up our chat box here Q&A box at the bottom. It looks like don't have any specific questions at the moment. And I apologize again about some technical difficulties. I don't know if anyone was listening out there, and if you are, I apologize. We're just trying to help our clients. We're not, trying to, trust me, we're not trying to get involved in anything that you guys are doing. So apologize. But I'll just reiterate that we're here to assist. You don't need to be an expert in this. We're certainly available to help out anyway. Looks like we do have one question here from Daniel Canton. Daniel, you're asking, are there any underwriting guidelines in place? And that's a great question. This is from an insurance perspective, obviously, and as Randy mentioned earlier, there are, this is an emerging coverage form. There are multiple types of coverage forms that are out there. There's no uniform coverage form like you see in other lines of business like property or general liability that are more established. So from an underwriting perspective, in our experience, Randy, you could probably support me here. When you have a client that is applying for a cyber liability policy, what type of application do they get? Is that like a simple couple of questions, or is this going to be like a more detailed application?
It's going to differ from carrier to carrier. I mean, that's just where we are with this stuff in this day and age. So realistically, some of the carriers that we work with that have kind of emerged with some of the better products, their applications and their questions, they're much lengthier. They're going to ask you a lot more questions about your business and some of the items that you're doing. But yeah, there's not any specific one thing that's standard across the board from an underwriting perspective. It is going to be different from carrier to carrier.
Absolutely. And normally what we see too, Daniel, just to answer your question a little bit further, is that the underwriters are going to ask a ton of technical questions. And what we recommend our clients do is just to hand that over to their IT professionals if they have them, because these are going to be sophisticated questions about the network, their existing security. So there are some guidelines in place. I think we touched upon some practical guidelines that businesses can follow. But as you can see, it's complicated, and you're going to need a team approach to this. So hopefully that's answered your questions. It does not look like we have any more, and we're just about at 3 o'clock here. What I'll say, in closing, again, is thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. We greatly appreciate the opportunity to discuss this emerging threat for businesses, both small, medium, and large. If you want to learn more about, how your business is exposed, if you would like to discuss some specifics about your business online, please contact Randy or myself. Our contact information is going to be provided with a copy of this presentation. And again, I apologize for technical difficulties that we encountered. Otherwise, thank you so much again. I hope you all stay healthy and safe. Be well and enjoy your weekends. Thank you.
Thank you.